Dustin, welcome to the
Yeah.
podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, same here. Finally get to meet you. I've been a fan of your work for a long time.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate that. It's yeah,
Yeah.
same. This is great. I gotta tell
Yeah.
you, your picture looks amazing.
Oh,
You're gonna
thanks.
be the best filmed guest I've had yet. I love the blurred background. You got the cool light coming on either side. What is it you're doing in there?
Um,
You got windows
I
on
just
either
have a team
side?
of people.
Yeah. I bet. Yeah, that looks
Yeah, I
good.
just hooked up my I have a good camera I use for photographing wildlife, so that's what I went with.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tried to do that for the podcast, but I've got so much equipment plugged in. My computer couldn't handle an SLR on top of that. So
Mm,
you just get what you get with me. But yeah, man, it's great. It's gonna be nice. People are gonna love this. But I gotta tell
cool.
you, I'm super excited to talk to you because I've got a son who's into wildlife photography,
Oh,
and
nice.
he's also a very talented draftsman. And so there's a chance he might get into painting. So I'm not just curious for me. I'm also curious for him. So I have lots and
Great.
lots of questions about all that kind of stuff. But let's get started with your background, though. I'm kind of curious how you got into it, into
Yeah.
painting. If you've always been an artist or what.
Yeah, no, I have always been an artist. I had a sketchbook, in my hand as a kid growing up all the way through school. Actually, it was a great way to make friends. I moved around a little bit when I was younger, and I found drawing really brought kids in, and they were really impressed. And so it was a good way to make friends, and it sort of stuck with me that way. But I didn't, growing up, think you could make a living at it. I was always under that impression, the artist myth of a starving artist.
Mm-hmm.
So I went into advertising, got a degree in visual communication, essentially graphic design, and went into advertising and spent it was probably about 8 years in advertising before I decided I just couldn't do that soul sucking job anymore. And
I feel like
I
I've
had
had
to get
another
out
guest
and
say that about
oh,
advertising. I
brutal.
can't remember now, but it seems like I'm getting some deja vu. What about it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
soul sucking?
Oh, it was, as an artist, you're sort of always wanting to paint for yourself, right? You wanted
Right.
to create for yourself. So that aspect of it was difficult because you were just a wrist for other people's things for the most part, and it got harder and harder to deal with clients making these sort of arbitrary, minute changes to things, and
Oh God, that's
the
so
work would suffer
frustrating.
for it. And you're just
Yeah.
like, oh, but the hours were brutal too. I mean, I always thought I would go into advertising, I'd start building a portfolio of my own that I could shop around the galleries, and that would be how I would transition. It just didn't work that way. Like it was
Mm.
just I was completely worn out by the end of the day. I'd sometimes work 20 hours at the agency. I'd sleep there, go to bed at 2 in the morning on the couch, get up at 6 and go back to work. Um, it
So
was
what's the
tough.
difference between being in advertising, being in marketing, and being a graphic designer?
So the graphic designer would just be sort of its own thing, right? Like with graphic design, you could go into marketing, you could go into advertising, but advertising is an industry where um, it's a little different in terms of marketing. I would say is a slower, more contemplative industry, right? Like it, it's borne out over longer periods of time. You develop campaigns, but it's always based on this particular marketing goal.
Mm.
Whereas advertising is very uh, sort of immediate and transitory, and you'll do work on a large campaign for months, and then it airs or it goes to print or whatever the case, and it runs for maybe a few months, sometimes a year. There's very seldom situations where a campaign will last years,
Right.
Um, and so it's very quick, and then it's on to the next thing, and you're always starting the next thing, and it's always it was needed yesterday.
Mm.
Um, and so it's really that pace that was difficult as a creative person to ever feel like you were producing something that was good,
Right.
that was doing the client the best possible service. And then, of course, you always had the client involved, which meant there was always compromises there, which are fine, but oftentimes they work to the detriment of the campaign in a lot of ways.
Isn't that
But
funny?
uh,
They hire a professional. This is a pet peeve of mine, even as a fine artist, and I'll tell you why in a minute.
yeah,
But it just amazes me, human behavior. They hire a professional, someone who's trained to be an advertiser, someone who knows all the ins and outs of manipulating the consumer, let's just say,
basically
right?
what it is.
And then they tell you what to do, how to do your job.
Yeah.
It's just drives. I had a client once say because I said to him, "This is how I do my commissions. I don't take input. Period." And he said, "Well, why would I ever tell a dog how to bark?" And I'm like, "Thank you, thank you, someone who gets it." Like, I'm not saying that we're all
Oh,
perfect at our jobs, but we're certainly better at painting than the average lawyer or doctor or right.
man.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And
It's
those
crazy how
clients
they
are the
shoot
best.
themselves in the foot. Like they
Oh, right.
hire a
I know.
pro and then
Yeah.
they try and do the work themselves.
And then there's this sense at the end that they're always a little disappointed. And you're like,
Yeah.
well, that's because you were too involved, like you didn't let the
Seriously.
artist do the work.
Yeah.
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 But
Well, the reason it's a pet peeve
yes.
of mine is because let me put it this way. I have had this particular corporate client that I don't work with them much. I went 12 years without working with them. And I'm just like, I'm not working with you guys, but they always want my work. And so I went 12 years without it. And then finally, after 12 years, I said, you know what? I'll try again. Other artists were telling me they're easier to work with. My gosh. So I tried again after 12 years. This was just recently. And they went through like 5 committees to quote unquote approve a painting and kept on
That
telling
sounds
me,
right.
yeah, kept on telling me the most ridiculous things. And none of these committee members are artists at all. And
Mm,
what's crazy when you get into the committee situation is everyone's trying to justify their job, right? Or their position. So they all have to critique or they're worried they won't be seen as relevant. So you get all these
absolutely.
completely arbitrary critiques about the most mundane things like can you just change that little fold in the fabric a little? I mean, the craziest stuff. And finally I just quit. I'm like, I'm not doing
Yeah.
this. You can have your money back.
So that's advertising, except every single day of your life.
Dude, I
Right?
would
Like it's
die.
just,
I can
oh,
see why
yeah,
that's soul sucking. Yeah.
totally was. So eventually, I was young. I didn't have any expenses really. I had my rent and like nothing else, right? I didn't have student
Yeah.
loans or anything. And so I was just, the nice thing about advertising, particularly in the late 90s, was that it was paying really well. It was sort of a dot-com boom. And I could jump from job to job and know that I would get a $10,000 raise every time I did it. And
Wow.
so I was making, by the time I was 25 and decided to leave, I was making six figures. And so
Wait, and so you were 25. What year would that have been?
that would have been 2000. I would have been 25 years old.
Really? You're
Yeah.
almost 50 years old?
Yeah. 49,
Hey, we're
born
the
in
exact same
74.
age, 72,
I know,
74?
right? It's
Yeah.
obviously the best year.
Obviously, you look young, man. You got a young face. Nice. Good for you.
Well, thank
Okay,
you.
so you were making six figures 20 years ago.
Yeah.
That's insane.
And that wasn't enough to keep me in it. Like
Yeah.
I just didn't care. And so I decided to start making a plan to leave. And nice thing was it didn't take long. I had money saved up. But I knew that when it came time for me to leave, when I just finally decided to and it was overnight, like I just quit my job and that was it. I had a year's worth of expenses in the bank, and I knew that I could take a year and not have to worry about an income for a while,
Hmm.
and I could just focus on creating some work and getting it to galleries. And my wife and I mean, we changed our entire lives. We were living at the time we were living in Phoenix. We had moved to Phoenix from Southern California. We moved out to the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. The town we moved to, I think, had
To save money?
102 people. Yeah, to save money because it was
Nebraska.
super.
There's other cheap
Yeah,
places, though. Why
there are.
Nebraska?
Because it was a centralized location for me to do the shows I knew I wanted to do, and
Oh,
many of
so you
them
could
were on
go
the
either
East Coast.
direction, basically.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And, my subject was always in the West. So
Right, right.
it was just sort of a centralized location. And that's what we did.
Well, what did your wife think of
We,
that? She like, I didn't sign up for this or what?
she thought I've always teased her that she's been hyper supportive, right? She's truly truly my biggest fan, no
Yeah.
doubt. Um, but I always tease her about, you were just thinking, oh, I can see this is a good investment, right? Like I'm just going to pay off in the end. Sorry, it hasn't worked out for her, but what do you do? No, she, no,
Wait a
she
minute,
was always
nobody,
really excited
nobody,
about it.
no wife thinks that supporting their husband in art is a good investment. Seriously,
Yeah.
that can't be what it was.
No, it wasn't. I think she could just see that I was really, and I'm generally a positive, happy person, but
Yeah.
it was really difficult, and she wasn't getting to spend a lot of time with me because I wasn't around a lot. I was, traveling for the agency and doing things like that. And so, yeah, it just wasn't a good situation. Now I could have maybe left and went to work for maybe a small design firm or an in-house art department or something like that. But I just really wanted out. And she was all for it. She didn't,
So you
she didn't
brought her
mind
in
at
the middle of
all.
nowhere and then you
Yeah.
started traveling and weren't even home. You're like, hey, have fun.
Yeah. That's basically what happened, right? Because we get to Nebraska and it's less than 6 months. And there's a town adjacent to the small town we moved into, maybe 30 minutes away. And there was a little gallery there. And they were like, I'd been introduced to through some friends that we had made while we were living there. And the gallery owner was like, well, hey, since you're just sort of building this body of work, why don't we do a show with you in 6 months? And you just build a body of work, do the show to give you something to work towards, and we'll hang it. And then, depending on how it goes, you'll have stuff to shop around to other galleries, et cetera. I was like, that's great. Deadlines are good for me, right? Because I find ways of sort of procrastinating if I don't
Same.
have them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did. I produced like 18 pieces for the show. And it's literally in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. This other town where this gallery is in, it's like 20,000 people. And 16 of the 18 paintings sold
In Nebraska, in a little
in
gallery in
Nebraska.
Nebraska.
And the show was shoulder to shoulder
In
in this small
Nebraska,
town in
did the whole
Nebraska.
town come?
Yeah. People from Omaha came, from Lincoln came, from
What?
certainly locally came. I couldn't believe it. Like the support was insane. It was totally, totally out of the blue. I had no idea
Did they
it was
sell
coming.
for a decent price point?
So at the time, I think my price ranges were anywhere from like $800 for something really small. I think my most expensive piece at the show was like $8,000. And
Okay.
so nothing crazy, right? I was just getting started, but it was enough to fund my entire next year of painting and not have to worry about income again. Like I had sold enough to do
Wow.
that. And so I just started producing work then, started applying to shows I wanted to get into. And I got into those shows and that was how it went. I basically sort of did that same thing for the next decade.
So
And there were ups and downs.
did you stay with this original gallery?
Yeah, I would give her work periodically. It was never like it was like I think I did one more show with her over the next 4 years, which is we lived in Nebraska for about 4 years. I did one more show with her, um, and it was never quite like it was that first time, right? I think everybody was like, "Oh, this is really cool," and then, "Oh, it's just Dustin's artwork," like it didn't matter as
Yeah,
much anymore.
it's probably because it's a small gallery, they basically used up their entire clientele in the first show.
Yeah, they may
Yeah.
have, yeah, absolutely. But for the next 4 years, we just plugged away, and then we ended up moving back to Phoenix, and it was the same thing. Just continued to work and make very little, but enough to keep going. And then one day I got into a really great gallery. I was invited to be into a major Western gallery, and after that, like everything changed. It was a totally different
What
world
gallery was
after
that?
that. It was Trailside Gallery in
Oh,
Jackson,
yeah, that's a
Wyoming.
major one. No kidding.
Yeah,
You still with them?
and yeah, I am. They have during just after the pandemic, they moved to strictly online. I think the owners were, the gallery had been around 50 plus years, and the owners I
Mm-hmm.
think were a little tired of the day to day, the sort of the clientele, the market. Certainly, the walk-ins were different in Jackson than they were even 10 years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
so they just decided to move online and put more of their focus on the auction side of things.
Right, right.
So yeah, I still do give them pieces periodically. I still do well with them, even online.
Okay.
Yeah.
Man. So just to clarify, you quit your job. You immediately, am I right? You immediately moved to Nebraska.
Yeah, it was in just a few months.
And then within 6 months, you're already got a whole year's income for the next year of painting.
Yeah, that's basically how it
So you
went down.
never really had the starving artist life. I mean, you might not have been rich, but you never
No,
went through that waiting tables and selling paintings period.
I never had to go back to a real job, Jeff. That's a big deal.
So that's
Like, yeah,
interesting
it's
because the
amazing. Yeah,
first thing you said, one of the first things you said when you got on the podcast was the starving artist myth,
yeah,
which really, I liked that the way you phrase that because that's how I perceive it. I always tell my students, it's like if every doctor, let me rephrase that. If every person that was interested in medicine could call themselves a doctor, we'd have starving doctors. If every or if every person interested in law called themselves a lawyer, we'd have starving lawyers. And that's the only reason they're a starving artist is because everyone thinks they're an artist.
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I agree. It's a myth. I mean, yes, there are some talented people that don't make it, but there are also incredible businesses that fail. I mean, there's always going to be that, right?
Yeah,
But that's really
unquestionably.
optimistic. I like that perspective.
Yeah, and I'm always having been, we both been in it for 20 plus years now, right?
Yeah.
I assume you kind of started roughly the same time as
2002
me.
is when I started. Yeah.
Yeah, same here. So, I've have enough experience now to know that even really great artists can do a lot to undermine their own career,
Oh, of
right? Like they
course.
just personality wise. And so it's not even an issue of whether or not you can make it financially as an artist. It comes down to a lot of setting aside, of course, just what you're doing, how good you are, how people connect with your work. You also have to be, you know, just a good sort of in some to some degree, a good, competent, reliable person, right? Like on
Right.
the just on the business end of it, because it's not long before you're promising galleries or museum shows a number of pieces, and then you show up with way fewer or something like that, or you're just not getting things done, and people just don't want to deal with that anymore. And it's a
Yeah.
great way to undermine your career, and you may be a really wonderful artist, but it didn't matter.
I like how you said personality could undermine your career. It reminds me of the soup Nazi. You ever watch Seinfeld?
Yeah, Seinfeld, yeah, absolutely. No
I'm
soup for you.
like, no soup for you. And I'm thinking in a real world, the soup Nazi's business would never last,
No, absolutely
Never.
not.
Only
Yeah,
on Seinfeld do they worship the soup Nazi's soup.
right, right. The novelty would wear off pretty quick of
Pretty
getting
quick.
treated like garbage, right?
Yeah, pretty quick.
Yeah. So
Man. So, okay. So then you get into trail side, and I guess everything's been pretty steady since then, as far as the career
absolutely.
goes. Okay.
Yeah, they've yeah, it's hard to actually quantify the impact. It's pretty
That's
amazing.
amazing. So, did you have kids when you made that switch?
No, and that's one of the keys, right, to being able to do this kind of thing without some of the stress, right? Like I
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
have a lot of normal life responsibilities, certainly no serious responsibilities
Right.
like children. And so it was easier that way. It was easier to save up a year's worth of expenses, right? Because I didn't have to feed and clothe and send children to school and all that stuff. And so it was just easier financially, and even time wise, right? Like kids are a big deal. Like they're hard work, and I don't know how you guys with kids as artists
Oh,
get
so
it
you
going
never
because
had
it's
kids?
we have never had kids. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I started my career. Well, let me put it this way. I built toward my career before we had kids. So we got married, and then I think we started having kids about 8 years into marriage.
yeah.
And when we had our first kids, I was at my senior year in college, and just I think, let me think, 2002. No, no, we had kids in 2003, and my first big show was 2002. So my career had already started. And then
Oh, nice.
by the time the kids were 11 months old or so, or not even 11 months old, by the time the kids were just a few months old, my wife was able to quit. But I don't think I would quit her job, meaning I don't think I would have had the guts to do it if my
Yeah.
kids, take all the risks that I initially
Oh
took.
man, I
Because
can't
even
imagine.
if it's not cheaper, I mean, even if let's say your wife is really expensive for some reason. I don't know why that would be, but let's say she's completely
You must know
dependent.
my wife.
Yeah,
No, I'm just kidding.
yeah, yeah. My wife is like the most what's the word? Low maintenance person in the world. I swear.
Same here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
lucky us.
yeah, but let's say that you have some other kind of expenses. There's the thing about kids is this overwhelming sense of responsibility and fear that you'll kill them if you do something stupid, or you'll starve them to death. It's like
Yeah,
it's just this psychological thing. So I was lucky that I didn't my career was already going when we had our first kids. So
nice.
yeah, but I agree with you. That would be challenging to take some scary
Yeah,
risks. You wouldn't
I
quit
can
your
see
job
why.
if you had kids. Most people wouldn't.
No,
Yeah.
it's funny. I was talking about this with another artist. Like, I'll teach workshops occasionally, and you get one or two young people in them, and most of the people are of retired age or close to. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons, right? Is that fear. Most of them have had kids, and
Yeah.
they've spent working a normal job their entire lives. They wanted to be artists their whole lives, and maybe they were, but they never were able to pursue it professionally because they didn't. They didn't. Sort of that fear of risk taking that is required, to really dive in and know that, financially you don't know where you're going to be day to day, year to year.
Yeah.
Uh, when you have children is too big a risk, so
It's
they just put it
scary.
off.
It would be
Yeah.
really scary. Yeah, and then there's the other side of it. If you're a woman and you want to have kids, I mean that's an added pressure. I mean
Oh, for sure.
I've got I don't know how many women who are my apprentices. Let me think. At least three of my apprentices are women whose kids have all grown and they're like, okay, now I'm
Now
going
I
to
can
do
go.
this
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, but they wanted
Yeah.
to have a family and they stayed home and then now they're doing it.
Yeah.
Which is admirable, but that's the added pressure of actually bearing children. I can't even imagine having to
Right.
balance that as
Right.
well. But
And selfishly, it bums me out because I'm like, oh, I'm as much an art lover as I am an artist. I just want to see more art. And it's sad that these folks, put off decades of creating great art to, you know, I'm sure they loved their kids, of
yeah,
course,
yeah.
but selfishly, I'm like,
Yeah, you know
oh,
what
I wish
though,
I would.
as this might not you might not see it this way because you haven't had kids, but the way I always make the joke that I've worked so hard to make paintings and to make a masterpiece, and I don't think I've made a masterpiece with oil paint yet. But it only took
Mhm.
me like 60 seconds to make my three kids and their perfection.
Nice. That's so, as a parent, like that's the way it
Maybe a
should
little more
be.
than 60 seconds. It might have taken a little more than 60 seconds,
Right.
at
Well, we'll
least for
talk
the
to your wife
last
later. We'll
one.
find out. Yeah,
Anyway, my
that's
wife
funny.
spent 9 months working on them, but
Yeah, yeah, she did. I mean,
yeah,
honestly, she put in more work
she
at
put
the
in a little bit
gate.
more
Yeah,
work.
yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, all right. So let's talk about your art a little bit. One of the things that, well, first of all, let me ask you this: did you always know you wanted to do wildlife art?
No, so originally, and this has a lot to do with the influences that sort of, played the biggest role in me being an artist. Is I really wanted to be a science fiction and fantasy illustrator
Oh, for
when I started
real?
out. Yeah,
No
yeah, and I
kidding.
came into it right as it died. There was a period, sort
There
of
was
in the
a
mid
there was a heyday
'90s.
for fantasy art. I wasn't even aware.
Oh, oh my gosh, you
Not in
wouldn't
the
believe it. Yeah,
fine
there's
art
some,
world, though.
no, no, it
Oh,
didn't. And in fact, I don't know that it even has really found its way. Certainly not into the global fine art world. Like it has its own little niche, I would say,
right,
but it's still a thing in terms of science fiction and fantasy illustration is still doing book covers and movie posters and all those
right.
kinds of things. But yeah, I really wanted to do that, and there were some artists whose work as a kid I just loved, and it was I would copy their work and try to you know emulate their styles and all that kind of thing growing up as a little kid, and they're probably the biggest influences on me. Certainly, once I got into high school and I really started getting hungry for other artists and seeking out more work, I fell into like the golden age of illustrators and all of those guys, like Howard Pyle and NC Wyeth, and I think it was there I started to discover wildlife artists too in that age, like Carl Rungus and William Knurt and these guys who. were deceased artists, but they had done some really interesting things
I
that
wondered if you
that
looked
were
at Carl Rungis. I'm a big
yeah,
fan. Yeah,
yeah,
interesting.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that was, I think that's where I started to really uh, put together this fact that I had grown up outdoorsy. We had always been camping and outdoors and stuff as a
Hmm.
kid, and I still love that. And I had a huge love of animals growing up, and still do, of course. And then I saw that there were artists doing wildlife in these really interesting ways, and that was where I think it was kind of born. And that was by the time I was in my early 20s, I had already decided like if I was going to be a fine artist, that was what I wanted to do because it was what got me most excited
Oh,
about
so
painting.
so you weren't into fantasy art when you were advertising. You're talking about as a teenager or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, like little kid, all the way through my teenage years. I still enjoyed it. Like even after I got out of school, I thought, well, I maybe could do some of it,
Yeah.
and I would do it on my own a little bit. But yeah, I sort of transitioned out of that once I started discovering, the world of fine art and other artists and things like that.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, here, let's go ahead and pull up your art. I mean, it feels a little early in the podcast, but I'm just dying to ask you questions about it.
Yeah,
So let's
shoot.
do that. Um, I want to know how it's made because,
Mm,
yeah, you mentioned, I want to know about, you mentioned you got this SLR or it's probably mirrorless camera right now.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, so obviously you have a relationship with photography, but your work doesn't look like a one-off photograph. I mean, like look, I'm looking at your face right now, and clearly you have a short depth of field on your camera now, but your paintings don't have short depth of field. You're obviously constructing these scenes. Am I wrong?
hmm. No, you're totally right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I want to know about that. But let's start by, let me
Yeah,
see, how do we navigate your site here? Oh, I can just kind of click,
yeah, and you can also go to portfolio and
let's do current
current
work.
work or
Or
yeah.
would you rather do Instagram? What's the easiest? What do you think's best?
It's up to you. It doesn't matter to
Okay.
me.
I
I
know
think
some people have
yeah,
Instagram up to date and not their website. That's why I want to ask that.
yeah.
But
I usually try to keep both pretty up to date.
okay, good. Okay. Man, oh man. All right. So I hesitate to jump right into this, but can we talk about that? How do you put a
Yeah,
painting together?
let's do it.
Because like I've followed my son a lot. I mean, and he's in Romania now and I miss him like crazy, but he would go on these, what he called adventures as a kid. And,
Mhm.
and not just as a kid, right up until he left on his mission at 19. And, he'd go up in the mountains alone and he'd look for stuff like this. But I know how hard it is to find by watching him. I mean, he spent hours and hours and hours and hours up in the mountains, and it is really difficult to find the animals, much less the animals in the positions you want, right? To get a good
Sure. Yeah,
composition. So
yeah.
maybe you could talk about that. You're obviously not just hitting the shutter and being like, boom, I'm painting that photo.
No, doesn't interest me even a little bit, to be
Yeah.
honest with
So
you.
tell me about that.
Yeah,
How are you putting these things together? I'm going to flip through as you do it. And maybe if I see
yeah.
one, you can you can tell me based on what you're seeing a little bit, but how do you put
Yeah.
them together?
So understand that when you first start out as a artist focusing on wildlife, that you really are in a lot of ways limited by the reference you have,
Hmm.
unless you're just a savant at drawing, right? Like, and there's a few guys out, but not very many. And so you are limited to some extent by your reference. But I've got a mountain of reference at this point. I've got 20 plus years of sketches, plein air work, photographs, and all of that stuff makes it into my paintings. And so how it works is, let's say I decide to take a trip somewhere,
Hmm.
and I'm there when I photograph animals, typically during the mornings and evenings, because that's when they're most active. So it's easier to do that. And then during the day, I'm painting or sketching or whatever, or I'll tackle animals that are out during the day. Like bison's a great example. They're out all the time. Pronghorn antelope are out all the time. So there are certain animals that you can photograph all day if you wanted to. And so I'll come back with a lot of reference, but what's most important is I've come back with a lot of ideas about what I would like to do. Either it's through things I've seen, behaviors I've seen. My work is I try to make my work largely narrative. I am trying to tell stories with the work, and that's why some of the paintings, the larger works, can be complicated, have lots of elements in them, lots of subject matter in them, etc.
Yeah. Well, like
Um,
this one, are they running from a fire or is that like sunset?
that's no, that's perfect. Yeah, no, I've tried to make it as subtle as possible, but yes, they are escaping a fire, a brush fire.
That's a narrative, all right. That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Um,
I didn't want to cut you off though. Go ahead and
no, 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 no.
continue. Yeah.
So I get back to the studio and I've got
Hmm.
all this stuff and I have ideas about what I want to do. And so I just start doing thumbnail sketches and I might do 10, 20, sometimes, depending on how complex the idea is, as many as 50. And they're super
50
simple, right? They're
sketches for
just,
one painting?
yeah. And because what I'm trying to do is, when I start, I don't know how complex I want it to be. I don't know. I I know the gist of the story I want to tell, but I don't know exactly how I want to tell it. So, for example, I'll start out deciding: is it going to be a wildlife painting with some landscape in it, or is it going to be a landscape painting with a little bit of wildlife in it? And
Yeah.
I'll start from that base because I don't want to ever be on the fence about those kinds of things. And so once that's decided, then I'll just start moving shapes around. These sketches, they're really just for me. Most
Well,
people,
that's
I
what
don't
I'm
think,
looking
could
at. You
even.
don't post them then. So,
No, I generally don't because people wouldn't be able to make a lot of sense of them
right,
until
right.
I could post them with the finished work, and the sketches I decided on would make sense to people. But
Okay.
generally speaking, when I'm running through all those really fast thumbnails, they just don't. They're all about just shape placement and value structure and how I want the design to work and all that kind of stuff. And once I've settled on
Hmm.
one, then I go back to my photographic reference and I'm really just looking for pieces, right? I'm looking, okay, I like those rocks. I like that deadfall. I'm gonna take that. I like the head of this animal. I'm gonna use it with this body and all that kind of stuff. And I just sort of Frankenstein all of that together.
Do you
But I
do that
started out,
digitally first or?
so I do now. Yeah, I do
Okay.
now. I used to just do it through drawings. So what I would do is I would take and do a rough sketch, decide on that which sketch over that was, decide on that, and then do a little bit more finished one, pretty rough still. I would lay a piece of tracing paper over the top of that, and I'd have all my reference printed out around me. And I would start refining that sketch, making things bigger or smaller if I wanted them to, but using that under sketch as a guide.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just keep layering like that until I got to something that was finished and complex, that I wanted. And that was how I would build something really complicated before digital, before I could just clip things out and move them
Hmm.
around. It's essentially the same thing, just
It
using,
is, yeah.
you know, transparent paper to do it. And so that's where I do it now. Once a digital sketch is finished, I've pretty much solved all the problems that fundamentally could sort of derail the painting process. Um, I'll just rough it in on the canvas with paint, just getting in my basic landmarks, and then go to work painting. And the nice thing about that is that because that sketch is pretty well refined, I can focus on other things like brushwork and texture and all that kind of stuff. I will make small changes as I work on the canvas, but overall, pretty much most of the issues I would run into are solved.
Wow. All right, I got some questions, but for those of you who are
Yeah,
listening, you really should be watching because I've been flipping through his art and it's really incredible. But is this a grizzly?
that is. Yeah,
Did you shoot this?
yeah, yeah,
How
yeah.
close were you to it?
Uh, 20 yards, but I had the protection of a car.
You were in the car? Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
yeah. We just stumbled across it.
That's amazing. You know what? Wow, I shouldn't say this because I'm going to get arrested or like have my kids take, they're adults now. They can't take them from me. But we
Right.
were in Yellowstone and we did have bear spray. I don't know what good it would have done, but we were driving down the street and all these cars were just starting to leave. And you know how when you've been to Yellowstone, of course, right?
Oh,
Of
many,
course
many,
you
many, many,
have.
many
How could you
times.
not
Yeah,
be? But
yeah.
we're driving and my son, he wants to see a bear so bad. And this was our last trip before he went to Romania. It was just me
Mm.
and him, and he wanted to see bears so bad. And we were just about to go home and we hadn't seen any bears. And then, but that day in the morning, we saw a black bear, but it was pretty far away. So that was one. We got to see the black bear. Then we're driving along and we're going to turn around and head home. But then we're like just a little further around one more bend. We come up to this group of cars that's starting to pull away. And we're like, well, obviously, as you know, in Yellowstone, when you see a group of cars, there's something that everyone's staring at, right?
Right, right.
And we get out when there's only one car left, and we walk over that car, and they're just fiddling around or something. And we said, what was it everyone looking at? They said there was a grizzly right in the road, and it went out into the woods. So, oh my gosh, to this day, I think I had nightmares after this happened because I was such a dumb dad. But my son was, he was 19 years old, so we're technically both adults. But we walked into the woods looking for the bear,
Mhm.
and both of us, of course, were nervous about it. But he wanted to see a grizzly so bad, and we found it. And I kid you not, when we saw the bear, it was in trees. So you've got kind of a clearing here, but it was in trees. So it was kind of coming, walking behind and then exposed and behind another tree and then exposed. You know what I mean? Just sort of,
Yeah, yeah,
right.
sure.
And so my son couldn't get a picture of it because he kept grabbing focus on twigs and branches and it was driving him crazy. So we kept getting closer and closer to this grizzly, and the grizzly was just looking at us as it was walking parallel to us. I kid you not, we couldn't have been more than like, let me think. I'm looking at my studio now and trying to imagine. We couldn't have been more than 75 feet from this thing.
Right.
And it had to have been a 900-pound grizzly. It was huge.
All by yourselves
All by
in the
ourselves,
woods.
and we're a long way from the car by the time we found it. But the thing is just walking along, and it'll look at us and then walk along, and we just walked parallel to it while my son's trying to photograph it. And all I
Yeah,
had was like a 4-inch knife in a sheath and bear
right.
spray. And the whole time thinking, is this really a bad decision? Is this really a bad decision? But both of us wanted to see it so bad. This is how people get mauled. And then I get home, I, I get home and I'm just like sick about it. I'm like, we could have been killed. My son could have been killed.
Right.
Of course, I would have sacrificed myself to the bear and told him to run. But I know for a fact because once we had a dog come into our yard that was very aggressive, my son would have done
Mm.
the same thing. So we both would have ended up feeding ourselves to the bear to save the other.
No, you've been an argument about it. No,
Yeah,
I'll
like, no,
feed
dad,
myself
I'm
to the bear.
sacrificing my life. I kid you not, a dog, this like rabid, not literally rabid, but it was a really aggressive dog, came into our yard, was trying
Yeah.
to bite us. And I kept pushing my son back and he kept pushing me back. No, dad, I'm getting bitten. No, Chase, I'm getting bitten. So I know we would have both fed ourselves to the bear. It was
Right.
terrible. I can't believe we did that. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
Total tangent. But so that's why I asked how
No,
far away you were from this thing.
and I've had instances, I've never gone like after a bear. I've definitely,
It's because
as a
you're
wildlife
smart.
artist, I've definitely tried to keep my distance from most animals. But there are situations that I've come across where, certainly come across a grizzly that you didn't know was there,
Yeah.
and it's really close, and you're just like, oh, this situation is terrible. I hope nothing happens. But luckily, I've been very fortunate. I haven't run into any trouble, certainly with bear. Like I had a moose one time uh, decide that I shouldn't be around, but I didn't get trampled or
It
anything, so
did.
that
What
was good.
happened?
So I was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It was very early. I went out to go paint at one of the lakes there, and it was during the moose breeding season. So the males are just nothing but anger and
Yeah.
attitude, and
Yeah.
and and moose are moose are kind of that way anyway. So it's just even worse. But I was out there painting, and this moose, he peeks his head out maybe 10 yards from me out of some really big bushes, and I'm looking over and I'm like, oh, here we go. So I just kind of left my easel. I started walking up the trail, to give him some space, and he followed me up that entire trail at least a quarter mile into a parking
He
lot
just
at the
fought. He was
trailhead.
stalking you practically.
Yeah, and then this was actually the most unnerving part for me was he literally stalked me around cars. Like I had to move around vehicles, and he would come around the car, and I would go around another
Was he
car, and
doing anything like threatening
just
noises
typical.
or
Yeah, who definitely was. Yeah, he was definitely being a bull moose. Right, like he's rocking his head, and he's
what?
making noises, and
Oh my
eventually, I
gosh, I
guess
would
he
have
just
wet my
got.
pants.
Well, it's lucky. So every time I go out, I always try and wear an adult diaper. I don't know. Just that's just wildlife tip number one.
Most
Um,
people bring a gun, you bring an adult diaper.
yeah, 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 yeah. So but eventually just got bored with me and finally moved on. But that's the only sort of dangerous situation I've ever really been in,
Oh my gosh.
luckily.
Do you know what I did with a moose once? So I'm originally from New York, and the biggest thing we
Yeah,
have, I mean, we don't see bears in New York much. I guess in, the closest place, the Harriman State Park, there are technically bears, but no one ever sees them really. The
mhm,
biggest thing we have are white-tailed deer, and they're like 150 pounds,
yeah,
So, but I went to school in Idaho when I was 17, and my brother-in-law and sister have a ranch there. And one time I would go there on the weekends to do ranching stuff. And one time me and my brother-in-law are driving along, and we come up to a moose, a female moose with a baby, and we just stop. And I didn't know what was happening. I didn't even think about it because I thought
yeah,
I saw the biggest white-tailed deer in the world. I'm like, I mean, I knew it was a moose, but I assumed it was
yeah,
harmless, like a white-tailed deer or a
yeah.
horse, like a tame horse or something. So I jump out of the car and start walking toward it. And my brother-in-law jumps out of the car and says, "Get your butt back in the
He's like,
car."
no.
Yeah, I had no idea they were dangerous. I would have walked right up to it.
Oh
I have a
man.
bad record with animals. I really should stay away from them. But
Yeah. Yeah, moose in particular, they
that's
could be
what I
quite
hear. I can't
temperamental.
believe I almost
Yeah.
did that. I will say I've never done it with a bison. I've learned my lesson. I don't walk up to bison, but so I've,
Yeah,
at least
bison
done
can
one
be
smart
really
thing.
dangerous. Yeah. Yeah,
So
but like your son trying to find animals, for example, I've national parks are really great for that
yeah, they
because
are.
the animals tend to be habituated to people to some degree. And so it's a little easier to find them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we had a lot of fun doing national parks, and we'll probably do more of it when
Yeah.
he gets back. But so, okay, so one question I have, you obviously have, I think you've pretty much explained your whole process, but one of the things that I find so difficult, let's take this painting. There's no way you saw them, or maybe you did. There's no way you
Mm-mm.
saw these deer, or I'm sorry, these are wait, don't help
Pronghorn.
me. Okay,
Okay.
pronghorn. I want to see
Sorry,
if I
I
knew my
beat you.
animals. I knew they weren't deer as
Right.
soon as I said it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't see this exact scene. You put it together the way you
No.
described. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's
Yeah.
say you have three different pictures of three different animals, right?
Hmm.
But you've managed to make the lighting look consistent.
Hmm.
So I know Carl Rungus to solve that, and I've done this as well with my paintings when I include animals. He would sculpt them in order to get convincing lighting, and at
Sure.
least I think that's the case if I remember right.
Yeah.
And how do you do it? How do you get convincing lighting when you're working with various photographs from various lighting situations?
Right. So, a couple of things. There's few tricks you can do. Like I said, I think I mentioned that a lot of times I will take photographs of animals morning and evening.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might think just intuitively that those are two different lighting situations, when in fact they're really not. The only difference between them is the temperature. And so temperature is pretty easy to correct as an artist. You don't have to, spend too much time figuring that out. But the light angles can be the same. They're just in opposite directions. So you can just
Well,
draw
no, not
things in
necessarily
reverse.
because okay, let's say let's say this animal right here is facing north, right?
Yeah.
So this if it were morning, the sun would be in the east, which is off to their right, right?
Mhm.
Well, but let's say you photographed this one and they were facing south or west. Well,
Right.
then it's going to be a completely different angle. This one might be lit from the head instead of the rear end or
Yeah. And there's absolutely, you know, that type of situation I wouldn't try to attempt. Like I would
Oh,
look for
okay.
reference where things were, where the lighting, I could make the lighting work depending on
Okay. So you're just
the lighting
really
situation.
you just have so much stuff that you're just like, okay, this lighting works, this lighting works.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, that's how you're doing it. Have you ever tried the
And then I can
sculpture thing?
just, I haven't actually. And I think if I was doing something where I really didn't have access to what I needed, it would be a good alternative. I know artists who've even gone beyond sculpture, and Carl Rungus is actually one of them, where they use a lot of, in particular,
Taxidermy?
wildlife art. Yeah, absolutely, taxidermy, or they're hunters, or I've even had some artist friends who have gone and collected roadkill to study how the anatomy works and things like that. That's a little past what I'm interested in or willing to
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
but there are artists who do it. And for me, I think I would attempt sculpting it if it was something I was really excited about, but didn't have access to the reference I needed. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an artist named Michael Coleman here in Utah. I think he's still here in
Yeah.
Utah.
Familiar with
You
his
know
work.
his
Yeah.
work? And
Yeah.
I've heard his
He and his
studio is
son.
extraordinary. I've heard he's a hunter. Michael Coleman, if you happen to know about this, you need to contact me, tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Michael Coleman, I've heard, has this incredible studio where he's hunted all these animals and he's got taxidermy everywhere. It looks like a
Oh, sure.
Cabela's or something. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. I
that's what I've
imagine.
heard. Someday I'd love to
Yeah.
see his studio,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
haven't
Yeah.
gone to
No,
that
I haven't seen
extreme
his
yet.
studio either.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen the studio either. There's, as a wildlife artist, there are things you have to, taxidermy doesn't always tell the truth, especially if it's not great taxidermy.
Yeah, there's some
There
bad
are
stuff out
muscles
there.
and things that occur structurally. Muscles will tense up when the legs are in certain positions that if you're not a really skilled taxidermist, you miss. It's true
Hmm.
with wildlife artists as well. Like artists get anatomy wrong all the time. I'm a little less strict when it comes to anatomy and wildlife art. I have a maybe a little different philosophy about that than a lot of my peers who work in wildlife art. In that the camera, you're an artist and I'm sure you've used photographic reference before. The
Hmm.
camera spends a lot of time lying to you as an artist, right? And particularly in wildlife art where we have to use telephoto lenses a lot. And so just there's a lot of
Oh,
photographic
that's
distortion
true.
as
It
an artist.
flattens it out. So
Absolutely.
wait
Yeah.
a
So you
minute.
have to,
Okay, go
yeah.
ahead. You're going to answer this.
Yeah, absolutely. So what helped me the most is painting from direct observation as much as possible. It allowed me to
Well, how do you do
sort of
that with an
intuitively.
animal?
You don't, right? Like I'm just talking about plein air painting, going out, doing the
Oh, okay.
landscape, understanding how perspective works, how things move backwards in space and atmospheric perspective, and all those kinds of things that come along with the environment and painting from direct observation of the environment. With animals, I have done a few paintings, plein air style with animals, but there are always the situations where they have to be laying down or they're an animal that just isn't going to move for 20
Yeah, you could
minutes.
probably do a bison on a good day.
Yeah, absolutely. And you
Yeah,
can do like an elk laying down or something because they're not going anywhere for a while.
right.
But in terms of all these complex movements, where you want to capture a lot of motion and things, yeah, there's just no way to do that except through the camera. But the camera also captures anatomy that, while technically correct, if you were to paint it, would look wrong.
Why is
And so
that?
my philosophy, let's imagine you're photographing an animal that's running, right? And you're shooting like 20 frames a second, capturing all that movement. And you get very weird in some of those frames, you get very weird leg positions, things that just don't aesthetically
Hmm.
look good, but also just anatomically, while they're correct, they just look odd. And if you were to paint them, it would look weird to people. And so my feeling about it is, if the anatomy is technically correct, you've painted it correctly, but it looks wrong, then it's wrong. And
Hmm.
the anatomy if you've painted it incorrectly, but it looks right, then it's right. Because the goal here, at least for me, is never about creating a great wildlife piece. It's just about creating a good painting. And
Hmm.
those kinds of things, I think if you're too strict about that, you can get it, you get a lesser painting out of something like that.
I just take a minute to recognize the people and companies that make this podcast possible. First, I want to thank you, my patrons. You are absolutely the most important and necessary sponsors of this podcast. Without you, we couldn't keep this thing going. If you love the show and are not yet a patron, please consider helping out. Go to theundrapedartist.com and click on the link Be My Patron on Podbean. And then just pick a monthly amount that fits your budget. What are 4 great podcasts a month worth to you? In my opinion, my sponsor, Rosemary Brushes, makes the best artist brushes available today. They have a huge inventory and are constantly innovating and adding new and interesting brushes to their line. They ship all over the world, and due to their exceptional customer service, you won't wait long to receive your order. To order some brushes for yourself, go to rosemaryandco.com. The HEIN Atelier began over 20 years ago in 2002. Due to limited space and high demand, in 2022, I adapted the entire curriculum to an online platform. While on our website and mobile app, students will find hundreds of hours of valuable recorded content. This online atelier is not just a website full of lessons, tutorials, and other resources. In this program, I personally mentor each student toward their artistic goals through weekly Zoom critiques, instruction, and regular in-app communications. To learn more or to sign up, go to HEINatelier.com. Lastly, whether you're watching or listening on Apple Podcasts or just listening on another station like Spotify, please consider leaving me a 5-star review. If you watch on YouTube, consider giving me a follow and a thumbs up. These things really help the channel.
And in terms of anatomy, there are, how would I describe it? As a wildlife artist, you might shoot a lot of photographs of an animal in movement, and a lot of the images might even be blurry. And so you're left with the one image where the anatomy looks weird. And I can always pick out artists who don't have a large reference library from which to draw from, because you can go, oh, well, that was the best photograph they had, And I don't even, in that situation, I don't even do that. I will either make it up based on how I understand the animals and through years and years of observing them. And because that's key to being a wildlife artist, or at least being one that's decent at creating a wildlife piece, is having an understanding of how anatomy works through observation, through seeing them all the time and observing them and sketching them, etc. And so I can make corrections to things. I can move some legs around and know that this muscle's going to create a little stronger shadow here because it's tensed up, and this is going to do that. But you can always tell when wildlife artists, particularly ones just starting out, don't have the reference they need to do what they're trying to achieve, or they just haven't been out enough and observed enough. Because they'll utilize reference that just doesn't make for good wildlife paintings.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So I want to ask you more about the focal length thing.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can find a painting where I think it might be an issue here. Man, I gotta tell you, some of these are just mind blowing. The lighting on this is freaking cool.
Thank you.
So cool. And you got to go pretty high to see those guys, don't you?
Yeah, they're
high.
actually, absolutely. They're one of my favorites to paint because, one, I love painting, quote unquote white, but mountain goats, like those, and bighorn sheep tend to be at really high elevations. And as a guy who just likes being outdoors, the tops of mountains are probably my favorite place to be. But also, those animals tend to be way more tolerant of people than the rest.
Oh, really?
And so, so I can just find a rock somewhere, sit down, relax, and generally spend quite a long period of time with something like bighorn sheep if I find them. And it isn't a fleeting experience like it is with something like a bear or a deer that's usually pretty timid and don't want any part of having a person around.
Okay, this is actually a perfect one to ask this question about focal length. So if let's say you took this with, and I want to know what you did photograph some of this with and how you put this particular one together, because this is pretty complex.
Yeah.
But let's say they were all standing there, maybe not in this exact position, but let's say they're all standing there, and you take this with, say, a 400 millimeter lens. You're kind of far away. The only time I've never personally seen mountain goats, but my wife has when she's hiked Mount Timpanogos, and they're far away. She was never able to get close, right? Let's say let's say your 600 millimeter lens, you're shooting them. You're not going to see any difference in their sizes from a 600 millimeter lens, right? They're all going to be the same. I mean, obviously you're going to see difference in the size from a juvenile to an adult. But what I mean is the closer ones to you are going to be the same size as the ones further from you, because the relative distance between the two goats is so minuscule compared to your distance from the first goat, right? So, you made a painting that looks like you're standing right next to them and shooting them with maybe a 50 millimeter lens, which is the human eye. Yeah. So how do you do that?
So I think a lot of that just comes from direct observation, having an intuitive sense of their scale as they move back in space. Like if you've done a lot of plein air painting, you begin to understand the differences very quickly between what the camera does in terms of flattening out those planes, having a very defined foreground, middle ground, and background that all appear to be just laid on top of each other. Versus when you're standing at a scene, there are things moving in and out of space, like there might be logs laying down that move back in perspective, or the way rocks do.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of animals, they do the same thing. So, I'm observing them the whole time, and I've done it enough that I have sort of lots of mental notes about that kind of thing, or how they move in space and how that relationship occurs in terms of their scale with each other. And so when I design the pieces, when I draw it up, I'm doing it largely by feel. Like this intuitively feels right based on what I know I've observed.
Or what it should
Um,
look like, I'm assuming. Because you
yeah,
because you didn't
there's
observe this. You didn't observe. When you say what I've
no,
observed, you mean my
yeah,
experience with nature with two 50 millimeter lenses on my face. Not
yeah, oh,
right.
absolutely.
Okay.
And when I'm photographing there, I'm not just having that camera in front of my face and only seeing the scene through that lens. I'm also taking rests as the animals do things that I'm not interested in, or whatever the case may be. In the case of this piece, it's actually one of the most um, amazing experiences I've ever had in terms of getting reference of animals. In that it was a very large herd of probably, I don't know, somewhere around 40 animals, and I could literally just get shots
You
of
can't be
different
serious.
individuals all over the place, and it lasted for like a half an hour, like
Were you
in
close
perfect
then
light.
in this case? You kind of close?
I was in At one point I was so close that I didn't realize I was actually standing in their way. I was kind of on a bit of a cliff face right at the edge, and there was nowhere for them to go on either side of me, and I hadn't realized it yet. So I had to sort of back out of their way so they could kind of make their way
Oh,
wherever
so even
they
though
were going.
so me choosing this painting, I'm sure you've had to implement these skills you talked about of imagining
Yeah.
how it should look. But in this painting, you actually got lucky and you were there to photograph it in the right perspective.
Yeah, a lot of those animals were, but they're still scattered out over maybe 50, 60, 70 yards. And
Oh,
I'm
and you're
and
squishing them
I'm
together.
mostly yeah, and I'm mostly, for most of that photographing time, at least 30 yards away from them anyway, just because I don't
Oh, so
it's
you're
just
not that
dangerous to be
close.
close.
Yeah, okay.
No, no, no. I'm definitely not close enough to where I could, whip out my iPhone, get a good photo of one of them. No
Okay.
way.
So
Yeah.
what do you think you were photographing them at? What focal length?
I would say between 100 millimeters and probably 300 millimeters was
Oh, so
where
it's still
my
flat.
focal length was
It's
being.
still going to be pretty
Yeah. Oh,
flat.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. But even with one goat, let me see if I
Mhm.
can. I know I saw some in perspective. Okay, like let's see. Okay, let's take this guy. No, because you with a bison, you probably could have set your camera on a rock and actually got that picture, huh?
I was actually laying on the ground to get that picture.
Oh, so you actually got that picture. Okay. All
Yeah,
right, let's
that's
take
that's a
this
bit of
guy.
a trick thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll talk about that in a minute, but let's take this guy. Okay, there is foreshortening in the wolf, right?
Yes.
And I know you didn't get close to this wolf.
Nah, not
Right.
close enough to see that. Yeah.
So
Still
you're
use the
not going to
telephoto
see
lens.
foreshortening in the wolf with a 400 millimeter lens. So you're actually
No.
modifying its structure when you paint from what you know it should look like. You're not copying the photo.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, key to being a good wildlife photographer or painters, because we are so reliant on the camera that we have to learn to correct for those kinds of photographic distortions. I mean, the same is true in the opposite direction. If I was really close to something using a wide angle, the foreshortening would be enormously exaggerated.
Right, right.
And so I would have to correct for that
But
as
that's not
well. And
likely to be an
so,
issue for you, though, as much as the other.
not most,
Yeah.
yeah, no, not most cases.
Yeah.
No, especially since I like the big animals.
Right. Huh. That's great. This is all really good information. All right. So tell
Yeah.
me about this one. That's scary.
Yeah. So I like to I like to make the joke that I got killed taking that photograph. And you're actually just talking to my ghost. But so in Custer State Park, South Dakota, there's a wild but very well managed herd of bison there, and
Mm-hmm.
the bison are amazing, and it's a really great park if you're a wildlife guy to go get good reference. But once a year they do a buffalo roundup, and a bunch of cowboys go out and they round up as many of the bison as they can, excluding the big bulls because they're a little too dangerous. But everybody else gets rounded up and they put them into corrals and then they put them into squeeze chutes and they check them for disease and vaccinate them. And they even sell some of the herd off there at the same time if the herd's getting too large.
Hmm.
So the wildlife biologist that's there allowed me and a couple other artists that were with me to go right up to the fence in front of the squeeze chute where they would put these animals in, squeeze them tight, check them, and then the animal would get released. And of course, the animal is just like totally freaking out and stressed. So they're running out of these squeeze chutes. And we were allowed to just lay down at the base of the fence and stick our lenses through the fence at these bison just coming out of these squeeze chutes over and
And this
over and
is a
over.
sturdy fence, I imagine.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but it's funny because a couple of us, even because I tend to go with other artists on these trips, but a couple of us literally had bison bump into the lens as they ran around the fence and stuff. So they were very very close, um,
Wow. Do you
but
ever
it
use
provided us an
drones?
opportunity. No, and in national parks it's illegal. You can't actually use
Yeah, I
drones
wondered
to do
that.
that.
Yeah.
But part of why I love doing it is sort of the challenge of it all. There's the painting side as an artist that I love, and it's why I do all this, of course. But then on the other side of that, there's just something about the fun of stumbling across something amazing in terms of wildlife or nature. And so I don't like I like using less,
Yeah.
just less technology, less that kind of, I just want to be out there and see what happens and try to make my footprint small because I don't want the animals influenced by me. They can pretty drastically alter their behavior, seem stressed out, and do things that, I'm not interested in. I would much prefer just to have them not know I'm there and be able to observe them and be watching these things happen and being inspired to create stories based on what I've seen occur.
Yeah. I'll tell you what though, I didn't know that drones were illegal in parks, and we used one
Mm.
in Antelope Island. I'm confessing all kinds of craziness today.
I've already I've already got to the FBI on the phone, so I don't know.
Yeah, no,
You're
serious.
probably
No, it's too late.
yeah.
I've already been in trouble for this, so it's all
Oh,
good. I've
okay,
paid my dues.
gotcha,
So
gotcha.
we had a drone in Antelope Island and we're flying it around the bison, and man, we were getting some crazy cool shots. They're not afraid of it.
No,
And
I would
uh
imagine it would be.
and we were flying it around, but then one of them headbutted my drone and it killed the drone. And
Oh,
yeah, we lost the drone. And at that point, the ranger came and said, "What are you guys doing?" Because I went out to try and find the drone, and the
yeah.
ranger's like, "What are you guys doing out there?" And we're like, "Well, we lost our drone." They're like, "You're not supposed to have a drone." I'm like, "Oh, oops."
Sorry. Yeah,
But we didn't hurt the
yeah,
bison.
yeah.
The bison was just like, it just like shoot it with its head like a fly, just boom.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, but man, we were
You're
getting
like,
some
who do
cool
I got to sue
shots.
to get this drone paid
Yeah, it was
for?
like a
This
giant.
bison ruined my drone.
Man, it was some crazy cool shots though, because they were just like it
I'll
was
bet.
to them it was like a dragonfly, and they're just like looking at it and like wondering, and we were
Yeah,
flying through them and getting these crazy shots. And anyway, and then I got in trouble, but
yeah.
so I'll never do that again. But just for the
Right,
record, I didn't know. I genuinely didn't
right.
know,
Fair
and
enough.
and no animals were hurt during that experience.
Yeah, only drones were
Only
destroyed at
drones
that
were
time.
hurt in my
Yeah,
wallet when I got fined.
that's right.
But anyway, yeah, well,
Wow.
I get that. I can appreciate that, trying to simplify it so that you enjoy the experience, though. I totally
Yeah,
understand that. I'm the same way with the figure, where I don't want too much technology because it takes the magic out of it in a way.
it does. Yeah, I think so. Takes some of the challenge out of it, and it's
Hmm.
I totally agree. It's in terms of wildlife, I don't think anybody just jumps in and decides they want to paint animals. You have to, like a lot of art, there are artists, and I think this should be the case, that are absolutely just in love with the act of creation, the act of painting, for example, or sculpting, and subject to some degree is irrelevant, right? But and I think all of us artists should have that. I certainly do. I mean, I'm happy to paint anything, but it's wildlife that I'm most inspired to paint. It's what gets me most excited to do it. And part of that is just being outdoors, and getting to see things that not a lot of people do get to see.
Yeah. It really must be a really fulfilling subject matter. My wife is always telling me when I get bummed out, you got to go outside, you got to go outside. And I think there's
Yeah.
something to that because when I plein air paint, there's this revitalizing effect that it has just being in the sun and
Yeah.
the nice breeze and all that. But to be in the presence of these incredible animals that are so majestic would just add another element of, I don't know, peace is maybe not the right word, but just I don't know, that connection to nature seems almost
Yeah.
divine in a way. You
No,
know?
and I totally agree. Absolutely. All of those things are
Yeah.
true. It's also, as an artist, it's also, there's a lot of diversity there. And
Mm-hmm.
as an artist who likes to paint stories about wildlife and nature, there's a lot of stories to be told.
Hmm.
I'm not just, I'm not painting a single subject. I have a lot of inspiration to draw from, you know.
So my son had a term for animals that he discovered for the first time. Um, it's not bucket list, but like, are you familiar with that? Where people who look
No,
for
I don't think so.
animals? Oh, what is that
Yeah.
term? Anyway, we'll just say your bucket list of animals for now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
are there certain animals that you have on your bucket list that you really want to put into your portfolio? I mean, obviously you're doing mostly Western American animals. Have you ever had the fantasy to go to Australia or Africa or anything like that?
Yeah, so I have been to Australia. I haven't painted any Australian wildlife or anything, but Africa is the big one, right? Like that's the one I would love to do, and I eventually will do it. I'm just I'm very much in love with what I paint now,
Yeah.
but yeah, if I had to put a list together of bucket list animals, I think it'd all be African animals
Really? I
for
wonder what the
sure. Yeah,
market
I
would
think
be for
so.
African animals.
Um, I think it does pretty well, particularly in Europe, actually.
Yeah.
African wildlife seems to do pretty well. I know some artists overseas and they do pretty well with African subject matter.
So if you did a series of African stuff, you'd probably have to find representation in Europe or somewhere overseas then.
Possibly, yeah, possibly. I don't know. I don't know. I
Because you just never see
it's a weird.
African wildlife in the US. I never see it.
No,
It's
you
rare.
don't.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. And having gone to attended and participated in a bunch of wildlife art shows, even there, you don't see as much of it as I would expect. You do see some, and some artists do well with it for sure. Um, it's to some degree. I don't know how you are about this, but I always feel like, as an artist whose focus is wildlife, I'm still not that interested in creating like a really good wildlife painting. I'm more interested in creating a great painting. And I'm hoping that as the artist, I'm hoping that painting transcends its subject, right? So that maybe somebody who's never looked at wildlife art before connects with my work emotionally in some way, just because I've done something interesting from a painting standpoint. That I think
Yeah.
that's the goal for me at least is uh, I want my work to transcend its subject to some degree. And I think if you're a really great artist and whether or not you paint wildlife or you, in the case of wildlife art, if you end up painting African, I think if it's still just a great painting, no matter, even if the subject is African, I think you'll still do okay.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, yes, I am. I do agree with that sentiment 100%. I think most painters, most serious painters would, because that's the point.
Yeah,
If it was just about the animals, you would just be a photographer, right? The
that's
whole
true.
the whole
Yeah,
point, not just be a photographer. That's a great thing, but you would be a photographer because the point of a photographer is to capture. At least this is how I perceive a wildlife photographer. Correct me if I'm wrong out there, all you wildlife photographers, but
oh, the
you're
comments.
yeah, I know. But as a photographer, a lot of I see that medium as much more of a documentary medium. Is that the right word? Documentary? Yeah.
I think to some degree, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
painting, at least for most of the painters that I know well, it's about making the paint. It's about the paint. And the subject
sure.
matter, if not secondary, is certainly not primary. You know,
Yeah.
it's not the only, or it's not the only thing that matters. But here's why I say I agree with you, but I'm not so sure that the public does.
Right.
I don't know
You
what the
may be
public
right.
thinks. I
Absolutely.
don't know what the public thinks, but I feel like the reason wildlife painting is so popular in the West are because people in the West want to bring the outside in, right? And when they buy wildlife, people from New York come to Park City and buy wildlife paintings, it's because they want to bring something back from the West. It's there's like I think the layperson has a much harder time separating subject matter from a painting than the painter, him or herself. But I could be wrong
Sure.
about that. I mean, obviously, you can't generalize the entire public, but
Right.
I would think from my experience, the majority of the public is much more subject matter, much more attracted to subject matter than the artist painting the paintings.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I think the general public, I mean, until you get into these sort of really elite collectors who's are just obsessed with art and the act of collecting art, the general populace, the couple that strolls into a gallery after spending time seeing a moose in Grand Teton National Park, and they stroll into a gallery in Jackson and they, oh, I want to take this moose painting back. That's I think that's the extent of which they look at the work. They don't maybe notice the subtleties that we as painters would notice. They don't really.
Isn't that a
I think
bummer?
super. Yeah, it really is. I was one of the biggest shocks to me as an artist when I got into a good gallery was the realization of how much the gallery plays a role in telling its own collectors what is or isn't good art. That I
Hmm.
always thought that anybody could look at a painting and tell whether it was good or not.
Yeah, it's
And
almost like
I
your
guess
job
that's
ends when you win over the dealer.
yeah,
But at
right.
least the
Because as an
dealer
artist,
knows better. So at least then you know you're working towards something legitimate and not,
yeah,
you know what I mean? Because then once you win them over, then they can convince the layperson that their opinion matters about your work,
absolutely.
right?
But as an artist, I had that bias. Right? I didn't realize that just Joe Schmo couldn't look at a painting and go, "That's a great painting." Like they might react to it emotionally a little different, but they don't necessarily know why. But they wouldn't be able to pick out those sorts of subtleties that we as artists notice. You
Yeah.
know,
Oh, it's so frustrating. We were at a
yeah.
plein air event a while back, and I don't mean this to be critical. We're all at different stages, and half of my paintings suck. So this is not being me trying to be critical, but
Right.
we're at this plein air event, and my wife is there, and I'm not certainly not knocking my wife. I adore my wife, and she's a very intelligent person, but she's not an artist, right? She's not a painter, so she
Sure.
doesn't see paintings the way we do. And we're going through the show at the end of the plein air event where all the painters do it. And my wife is attracted to all the ones that have something sentimental in them, like a
Mm.
cute little house with a picket fence, or like,
Right.
or like a bird landing in the water, or like something.
Yeah.
And they're not even close to the best paintings. In fact, oftentimes they're the worst paintings. And I'm just like, it's just making me so depressed. I'm just like, I'm like, Jen, why do you like that one? She's like, look at the little house,
Yeah. Oh my God, it's
it's
so
so
cute.
cute. I'd love to live in that house. And I'm like, oh, I'm
Right.
dying inside right now. I'm dying inside.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know exactly how you feel. Like we actually have a kind of a inside joke with me and some artist friends of mine who are also wildlife artists that if you do a fox and just put a little snow on the nose, that everybody's gonna love that.
That's classic.
It's a little, ding,
Or
right
even
there,
better, have a
sets it off.
butterfly landing on his nose.
Oh yeah, that's just a sold painting. You
Yeah.
couldn't make enough of those. Oh
Yeah. You better start cranking out the prints of that one.
yeah, that syrupy, sweet, sentimental stuff. Oh, that's a little much for me. Yeah,
I
but it
know.
does. A lot of people who are less sort of, I don't know, sophisticated in their art taste, or maybe they just sort of just started getting exposed to art. Yeah, they don't see the subtleties that we do. One of the other things that I've noticed in terms of that kind of thing is there's a lot of people, particularly, and maybe this is true across figurative work and portraiture and still life, but certainly in wildlife art, is there is this reverence for photographic realism
Oh,
in
I was going to
wildlife art
bring that
that
up. Yeah.
that just
That drives me
ruins
crazy.
me. I hate it. I hate everything about a painting should be a painting, right? Like it shouldn't
Right,
look like a
right.
photograph. And while it may be an interesting demonstration of eye-hand coordination, it's just not interesting as to me, at least. It's just not interesting as a piece of art. Like
No,
you've
I'm not a
rendered
huge fan
yourself.
of it either.
You,
Yeah,
yeah,
I get the people are enamored with what human beings can do. But what's frustrating about that is what many people don't realize. This is my opinion on this. I'd be interested to think or know what your opinion is.
yeah,
Photorealism or hyperrealism is more time consuming, but easier because you don't have to interpret anything. You just paint
right,
pour for pour exactly the way you see it. There's no interpretation, no decisions, no problem solving, just copy
right.
like a machine. And it's not
Yeah,
harder, it's easier. It's just really time consuming, but there's this reverence for it, like you said. It's just like there's so much more to painting.
yeah.
And I know a lot of people don't feel differently about that, and fine, everyone can feel how they want, but I'm with you 100%. When I look at a painting, I want to see paint, you know?
Absolutely. I want to see the artist in the work, right?
Hmm.
Like photographic realism does nothing but render you as the artist out of your own work.
That's
You
an
really
interesting way
just
of putting it. Yeah, I agree.
you just don't exist anymore. It's just essentially a human produced Xerox copy of whatever
except
it is you're
for
doing.
I'll play devil's advocate now. But again,
Yeah.
I'm with you 100%. I'm not a fan of hyperrealism. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just not a fan. But obviously, it there is the element of just the appreciation for what humans are capable of, right? And so,
Sure, for sure. I
what
absolutely
is
think it's a
juggling,
skill.
right? Like, what is juggling?
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah.
What is that doing for
Right.
society, right? But it's cool when someone can juggle five or
Yeah.
six balls, and people are like,
Oh yeah.
"Whoa, you can juggle five or
Yeah.
six balls!" Like, it's cool, and that's what it is about it. People are just like, "Whoa, that can be done! Like the human being can do that." So there
Yeah.
is that. But to me, and I think this is what you're saying, art is so much more than what you can do. It's
Mhm.
because a lot of people can learn to play an instrument and mimic Mozart, but no, but they're not Mozart, right?
Right.
Mozart composed the music,
Yeah.
and he
Absolutely.
made it his own. He didn't just replicate someone else's music, and in this case, it would be the camera's music.
Yeah.
Um, he made it his own. So, is it impressive to play a complex Mozart piece? Obviously, you can't
Hmm.
discount that. But what's more impressive? Compose one,
Right.
under your own name, right? And that's how I kind
Yeah.
of look at it.
No, I totally
Yeah.
agree. I'm in that exact same boat for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's look at a few more paintings here.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. What is this? Is this just a little quick study or a beginning of a
Yeah. It's
painting?
the block in. Yeah.
Oh, that's how you block it in.
Yeah.
So you work in
Yeah. My
layers then.
absolutely. Yeah. So it starts off just a thin wash block in, which is what you're looking at here. Then I
Well, that's
do
not
a
that
second
thin though.
layer.
That's not that thin. Oh,
It
some of it
it
is.
looks it looks uh it looks thicker than you might
Oh,
actually
really?
like. I when I paint it, yeah, I usually so at the very first stage, the block in stage, I use liquid to thin the paints, and it's
Oh, you
pretty
start
close
with
to
liquid.
yeah, it's pretty close to the consistency of ink. After that, I don't use any medium at all. I just use the paints right out of the tube. But that first block in stage, it's very thin.
So you use liquid so it'll be dry the next day, I'm assuming.
Yeah, dry the next day. And liquid as an alkaline resin is a really durable surface to paint on.
Right. You don't
It
have to
just
worry about
creates a
it
really
cracking
strong
the top
bond.
layer and all that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, yeah,
Wow. Yeah. I'm just going to click through here. If you see any that you want to
yeah,
comment on. Now, do
sure.
you ever, when I look at this, I think, okay, who's ever seen a mountain lion? They're so hard to find until they attack
Literally,
you, right?
I'll t- so, exactly. And then it's just brief.
And then
You only see it
then you don't have
briefly.
time to get your camera out. It's so
Yeah,
inconvenient.
right. Well, I just have
So
them attack somebody with me, right? Like I just hang, I
yeah,
put a lot of
you're
bacon in
like,
their pocket.
don't fight back yet.
Yeah,
Just give me a minute to get a
I'm
few
not done getting
shots.
good photos. Absolutely.
So do you ever use other people's photography or you always
No,
no? So you
I
really
I
found a
do
mountain
not.
lion.
I did not actually. Actually, there.
You made up a mountain
The
lion?
No, I didn't do that
Okay, I'm
either.
gonna let
So
you
the very
answer.
first
Sorry.
mountain. Oh, don't worry. I'm letting you in on the secret of some
Okay.
wildlife artists. The first mountain lion I ever saw was actually last year. It's the first one I ever saw in the wild after 20 plus years of being out. I
How
saw my
close were
first
you to
one.
that? I mean, was it
I
pretty good?
was It was a football field away at least,
But did you have a
and in
long
fact,
lens so you could really see
I
it?
did,
Okay.
but it was still so far away that I like to use the photograph as one of those find where's Waldo kind of things where I'm like trying to
Oh,
find a
that's
mountain
a
lion
bummer. Well, at
in
least
this
you
field.
saw
Yeah,
one.
so yeah, and that's how I feel about it. But so there are model. You could literally hire certain animals as models, the same types of
Shut
animals they used in
up.
movies. Swear,
This is
yeah,
a tame
absolutely.
mountain lion?
That is basically an actor for hire.
No freaking way.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
is this?
So in Montana, there's an outfit called Triple D Game Ranch, and they
What?
have all kinds of animals and predators that you can, as an artist, if you have trouble getting reference of them in the wild, you could just hire a model.
Wow, you just opened up a yeah, big wildlife painter's secret right there. So is that how you got some of your wolves and stuff too?
Yeah, some of the wolves. I have been fortunate enough that I've actually seen quite a lot of wolves in the
You
wild. So
have, really.
yeah, so most of the time I don't have to hire wolf models, but mountain lion for sure. Like I said, the first one I'd ever seen was just last year.
Wow. So tell me about how that works. You go, you pay them.
Yep,
Well, you have a
you get
certain
a
amount of
session.
time with them.
Yep. It's usually like a half hour, I think usually. It depends on the animal. A lot of times, like if the animal's just not interested, they don't force it to do anything. And as a wildlife artist, I don't want it to really do any, you know, tricks or anything like
Well, of
that. I just
course
want it to
not. Yeah.
behave naturally. So um it just gives me close access without any fencing or anything between us, and the animals are healthy and they're not just fat, lazy animals laying around. So they look good.
Huh.
As an artist, you only have to make small adjustments to make them look wild. Um, but
Okay.
yeah, it's
What is that? What makes an animal
oh,
like this not look wild?
it's hard to describe, but there are particularly. Let's talk about mountain lions. So the first thing you could recognize in a mountain lion that isn't wild, that was photographed at a zoo or something, is just its weight. It'll have like a lot of belly looking fur hanging down. They tend to there's
So it's
something about
heavier.
the
It's well fed.
it's it's heavier, yeah, and it doesn't get the exercise it normally would, and so it looks overweight compared to what you would see in the wild. Um, a lot of times there's something in the eyes that is very different from a wild animal to a more docile sort of trained animal. There's just an intensity there that's missing. In the case of wolves, I actually generally exaggerate the way the eyes look on a wolf. This is something specific to wildlife art, and I talk about this to people who are just starting out as wildlife artists. Is that everybody who's going to see your work has a perception of what this animal looks like in their own head,
Mm-hmm.
and
Oh yeah, it's that way for a
animals.
Jesus painter too. Don't get me started.
There you go. And so you have to find this odd balance between what you actually observed in an animal in the
Yeah.
wild, which as an individual, that animal can look quite different than what is in people's heads about what an animal should look like. And so you have to find that balance with an artist, whatever that is. And I find that making wolf eyes more intense, more angular, less dog like, less pet like, which they can look that way. I mean, they are, dogs' distant relatives. So um, goes a long way into making a wolf look more naturally wild.
Hmm.
But in a scenario like this where it's a wolf for hire or a mountain lion for hire, um, you have to make little changes about the intensity. Um, the eyes are always very focused when they're wild. They're very alert seeming, whereas in zoos or even in this situation where you hire models, animal models for a photographic session, they're just not as intense. They're not as focused looking as
And
an
that
animal
I
in the
would
wild.
assume that's probably just because in the wild, a predator is in two states, sleep,
Mm-hmm.
hunt, sleep, hunt. There's not a lot of in between.
100% true.
Yeah.
They're absolutely, and they're always in this weird state of there's a state of fear that they're kind of always in as well, because being a wild animal is hard. It's a dangerous job.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So they're not worried about being preyed upon. They're just concerned about their next meal, is what you mean.
Well, not necessarily. There's a reason you don't see um, predators very often, and that's because they've been extensively hunted throughout the
Oh, they're
course
afraid
of
of men.
afraid of people. So the thing about a mountain lion in particular is you've almost certainly come across them, but they've always seen you long before you saw them, and
That's
so
so
you just never
scary.
get to see them. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
true.
So do you have some kind of a handler there when you are with this lion?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
And what does the handler do? Just stand there with a gun or a taser or something?
Hey, so the good ones generally don't have, at least don't have lethal weapons there. I have been, and I don't go to these anymore because I just don't have any use for them anymore. Um, but when I did attend them, I did learn to one where the guy had a sidearm for sure. But most of them are just they tend to they want to invoke, as the artist, I tell them what I'm looking for when I go to do the session,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll say I'm just looking for natural behaviors, things that cats do in the wild and stuff. And they're like, okay, no problem. So it's really pretty funny, but they treat it just like they would a house cat, right? Like they put a sock kind of a thing on the end of a stick, and the cat acts just like your cat at your house would, where they will chase it around and grapple with it and do things like that. And it's basically a kind of play. Like the handler is interacting with the animal in a form of play. And
Yeah.
as the artist, I'm just taking lots of photographs of all that movement.
That's the thing about that's so fascinating about the animal kingdom. And maybe I'm just simple minded, so other people don't find this interesting. But we have these little Maltipoos, these little tiny dogs. And
Yeah.
I wanted the manliest dog I could find. So I got a 6 pound Maltipoo. I know it's
Nice.
impressive. Yeah. But so we have these little Maltipoos and they're freaking awesome. And they're seriously the coolest pets in the world because they're so loving and sweet and they're playful like you described the cats.
Yeah.
And then, but it always amazes me when I see, like, one of my students has this huge German Shepherd, huge, and the thing is scary as all get out. And my dogs, when they bark, it's like, "Meow, meow, meow," like just those little yapping. This thing barks and it's like,
Yeah.
"Roof," whoa, that was loud, like, "Roof," just this crazy, scary bark. And she brings it to the
Right.
studio at night because she feels more comfortable downtown with her dog.
Hmm.
And but what's interesting is mentally, they're both just, even though this one is could kill me and the other one couldn't even do any damage at all, they're both just as playful and sweet and innocent. And
Hmm.
it's often made me think about predators. We think of like lions and wolves and everything as these dangerous animals, but they're just hungry. And other than that, they're probably just these sweet little things like my Maltipoos, you know? It's not like human beings that hunt for sport, right?
Right.
They're just hungry. So I'm probably
Yeah.
the
There's
only one
not.
that's ever thought about that, but I guess it's because I'm so simple minded, but
Yeah, there's not a lot of examples in nature of animals hunting for sport. It's funny,
no.
the higher you move up in terms of intelligence, the more likely that is to happen. So, like, you run into things like
Yeah, like
killer whales, for
chimpanzees.
example, or
Yeah.
chimpanzees. Yeah, doing that kind of thing. But animals like your predators here in North America, it really is just survival. Is
Mm-hmm.
is what it comes down to. You take out all those necessities that come with survival, and you end up with domesticated dogs, right? Like they're
Right.
just happy to be alive and they don't care about anything but just being loyal and
Mm-hmm.
playing and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. All
Now
right.
it takes thousands of years to get there, but
Yeah, yeah. Just
eventually,
just a little disclaimer for the audience. Don't go out and find a
yeah,
wolf
yeah.
as a pet.
Don't try,
Yeah.
don't try to tame a mountain lion and expect it to act like your house cat.
They're not that sweet.
No, no, no.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Let's see some, man, this lighting is gorgeous too. Wow. That is just gorgeous.
Thank you.
I
Yeah,
love
that's
that
just that's
backlight.
basically my backyard. That's Colorado.
Really? Wait, I thought you lived in
Yeah.
Arizona.
I did. I actually moved to I've been in Colorado a while now. It's been my we're just be 8 years now.
Oh, no kidding. And these are elk,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. Yep.
Man, yeah. So this is a backlit. What's so beautiful about this is just that lighting. It's just gorgeous. And then the depth in this thing, the mountains, the way they sit back. Oh, it's just beautiful. Man,
Thank you.
that's gorgeous. Do you have a favorite subject matter? I think you said mountain goats are one of your favorite animals to find, but
Yeah. In
what
terms of the
others?
wildlife art,
Yeah.
mountain goats and bighorn sheep are really my true favorites, and less to do with the kinds of paintings I create with them, and more to do with just how accommodating they are to me, the idiot artist, trying to get photographs. Like they're generally very calm and docile seeming, and certainly dangerous, but like not in the way something like a moose or even an elk or any of the predators would be. And so you can
Yeah.
just spend more time observing without feeling like you're bothering them.
Hmm. Yeah. This bighorn sheep reminds me, I got to show you. And this is just me being a dad, but let me show you a photo that my son did of bighorn sheep. He was so excited because these things just came right up on him.
Nice.
And, ah, this site is no longer active. Oh, he let his
Ooh.
site die. Okay, we're not going to see it today. I didn't know he did that. Well, that's a shame. I'll have to talk to him about that. Anyway, it was this gorgeous picture though of bighorn sheep, but they just came right up on him and they were leaping over rocks. And he was like at the
Oh,
base of the rock while they're just kind of coming over it. And he got this
yeah.
amazing shot. I was just like,
Oh
wow.
man.
He was a
I
little
would
bit
love that.
scared, I think.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
every now and then you get lucky, right? And they just kind of come right up on you.
Yeah. And that's that carrot that's always being dangled as a wildlife artist. You're always waiting for that sort of amazing experience to happen. And it
Hmm.
happens incredibly rarely. Like I've been doing this, 20 plus years, and I can count on one hand the number of encounters with wildlife that were truly special.
What an interesting, this is a really interesting drawing. It's beautiful.
Thanks.
But I had a friend who crosshatched like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're the only second person I've seen crosshatch like that.
Yeah. I think it's just an interesting way to add texture to a
Yeah, it's
drawing.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really cool. Okay, another bear one with crows. This is such a great idea. So you say that you're trying to do narratives in your paintings.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk to me a little bit about how that process works. You've told me technically how you put them together, but
Sure.
how do you come up with the narratives? Why did you decide to put crows with the bear and the bear kind of peering at the crows like he's kind of like
Right.
not irritated, but just like, what's happening back there?
So bears and crows or ravens have a very close relationship. In fact,
Oh, I didn't
ravens
know
in
that.
general have close relationships with predators in general, and it
Is that
comes
because they're
down
scavengers?
to a degree, yes. It has more to do with their actual anatomy and the logistics of their biology, and that is that ravens and crows, we'll just talk about ravens in this case. They don't really have an ability to break into a carcass and eat, right? So they tend to pay attention to what bears are doing and things like that, and they wait for other predators to make a kill and open up a carcass so that they can eat. And so there's this sort of semi symbiotic relationship that happens between them.
Hmm.
And anytime I've observed it in the wild, it's always been this, there's always been this apparent annoyance by the predator, particularly in this case, a bear. Like the bear's just annoyed
Oh, so he is
because these
kind of
things are
annoyed. I
always,
want. I
yeah, because
got.
these birds are just always around, and he's constantly having to shoo them away. And yeah, there's just that's the whole story behind this one is this relationship where the bear's just annoyed by having these ravens hanging out with him.
Have you ever painted it or even toyed with painting a carcass or a hunting scene?
I
Not a
have
man hunting scene, but an animal hunting scene.
right. I definitely have, and in some of the paintings, I've even done it secretly. Like there are, if you're really in tune with certain species of wildlife, ravens, for example, I did a raven painting. It was really just this old sort of twisted tree and had a bunch of ravens in it. And if you know anything about ravens, they generally don't hang out in big groups. You find them in pairs quite often, but the only time they get together in large groups is when there's a food source nearby, or a carcass. And so that the story of that painting is that there's literally a carcass there, but I didn't show it. And you would only know that if you knew that particular behavioral aspect of ravens. But I have painted a carcass, I think actually in the painting once. I tend to stay away from it. It
Well, yeah,
has a
it's not a
little bit
good
of,
selling point, that's for sure.
no, it's not. And it also is a little bit like, you know how artists will rely, we just kind of talk about it, will rely heavily on that sort of syrupy, sweet kind of sentimental quality in a work, you know? I think there's to some degree the opposite with painting things that someone might find, shocking, or that kind of thing, like relying on the shock factor of having just an open bloody carcass on a painting. Like, I don't know, it doesn't
Yeah, I
seem.
guess it could work both ways. You could get a
Yeah,
certain audience that just wants the gore.
yeah, or people just look at it and go, oh, he's just trying to get a reaction, like that's why he did that. And that's not usually, I'm not, that isn't my goal when I'm doing a painting.
Right.
I'm not looking to shock anybody by anything. I have seen artists pull it off, and I've never really, I mean, like I say, I've done it maybe once. I've never really tried, but I have seen a couple artists
Do you
pull
have
it
an
off.
example of that? I'm curious. If
There's an older painting by an artist named Greg Beecham. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's a
mm-mm.
wildlife artist as well, and it's of a mountain lion. I believe the title of that painting is called "Too Much Pepper," and
It's
it is a
Greg
carcass painting.
Beecham.
The mountain lion is just Greg Beecham. Yeah,
How do you spell that?
Beecham,
And then what's the name of the
and
painting?
I believe the name of the painting is "Too Much Pepper."
Too much pepper.
Yeah,
That's pretty funny.
and it is a carcass painting, but it's super colorful and rich, and I don't know, it's just really well done. If I was to do one, it probably would be something similar to that.
Is this an
But
artist that you look up to?
it's, yeah, for sure. He's probably got 20 years of painting on me, so and his work is really good. And I actually,
Well,
it isn't so
I
much
don't know if
how
this is it, but this is
that
one.
that I think that's it's if that's not it, that's definitely what it was basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
he's it's what really blows me away about his work is the way he handles paint. Like in person, his paintings are absolutely delicious to look at. They are just beautiful textures, and
It's
the
got a real
paint is
classical
luscious.
quality.
And he does, yeah. And he tends to more err on the side of, just sort of depicting singular animals in a piece and things like that,
And
particularly
then I
now.
pull up one with a whole bunch of animals.
Yeah,
Right when
these
you
are
said that.
that's right. That's a little older piece,
Yeah.
but now he's sort of focused in more on just a single animal with more abstraction in the backgrounds and things like that. But his
Huh.
paint quality is just
Yeah, that's
stellar.
interesting. Yeah, that would be the first painting I can remember seeing with a carcass.
Yeah,
Yeah. Hmm. Well, this has been fun, man. It's been great learning about your paintings and your process. It's just it's been
absolutely.
it's
Thank
been
you.
a blast. So I don't know if you've ever heard the podcast before, but I always finish with the same question, and that
Yeah.
is if you could give one piece of advice to aspiring artists that you wish you had or that you even had that you value, what would it
Hmm.
be?
That's tough. If I had to narrow it down,
Mm-hmm.
and this is obviously just drawn from my own personal experience, it would be to not compare yourself to other artists.
Hmm.
I always felt like it's great to look at another artist's work and admire the qualities and be like, hey, I would love to bring some of these qualities to my work. I love the way they handle textures and things like that, and I would love to, discover that in my own work. But to compare yourself to art, to constantly be in this state of self doubt and sort of just constantly going, oh man, they're so great, I'll never get there. That doesn't do anything but just undermine you as an
Mm-hmm.
artist. I think it's important to just know that you need to do your own work, um, and do it as well as you can. And hopefully it will find an audience, and that other artist's work is their own work.
Yeah. And the other thing about that that's really difficult in this day and age, and we may have talked about this because you're not the first one to say something like this,
Mm.
is with social media now, everyone puts their best work out there and we never get to see their blunders. So if you go down that path of comparing yourself to other artists, it can be really dangerous because you get this false perception of what other artists are, and it's not fair to
Absolutely.
you to do that.
Yeah.
So,
That's why podcasts are great like this, because I think it does, especially younger artists who just don't have the years of experience to know that most of us struggle,
yeah.
with it. We just do. I think to some degree, that's partly why I like it. If it wasn't challenging, I wouldn't enjoy it. And I have failures all the time. Like that just happens. But those failures are always teaching moments, right? You always learn to do things a little differently or a little better the next time around. And you're absolutely right. Social media eliminates that whole side of what it means to be an artist. It just shows us the glossy side,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's great advice. Thanks again. It's been great. I've had a blast.
Jeff, thank you. I appreciate it, man.
Thanks for tuning in to the Undraped Artist Podcast. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And if you could, leave a comment or review. That really helps the channel. Please share the show with your friends, and if you're feeling generous, consider a monthly donation at theundrapedartist.com. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.